Hey everyone, welcome back to the group theory seminar. This week we'll be covering restorative justice practices and specifically within that circle processes group theory. This will take the similar format as before. We're going to have a couple primary sections focusing on the overview and the inception of the theory, some core concepts related to the approach. We're describing some specific interventions. This is going to be quite a different style and format and unique, I think, compared to other group theories, as well as trying to talk about some of the value systems of restorative justice and going into some of the more spiritual or core tenets that differentiate it from a lot of the Eurocentric group theories, since this is largely associated with a lot of indigenous cultures and more ancient or indigenous practices. We'll also be highlighting what to use this with in terms of both within a work context, within a group context, as well as a social justice anti-racist frame, which has been kind of a shift in restorative justice literature and focus is how to use this within intergroup dialogues. So for this, there's quite a few books that were referenced. I really recommend each of these in different ways. The big book of restorative justice is an audiobook picture that has like 4 of them mashed together. And it's a really helpful collage. The 2 that I'm primarily focusing on in this are the Restorative Justice by Howard Zur and Circle Processes by Kate Pranis. That gives us a good overview of the values and theories, as well as like how to and what is circle process like within that. The Little Book of Race and Restorative Justice by Linnea Davis is a good overview of how race has largely been surprisingly ignored in terms of restorative justice and its focus as it was being, began to be used or discovered in the West. Again, all these practices have been around for quite some time. The Circle Way was a book that really gave a more pragmatic guide as far as like how this looks to set it up, to go through the process, what challenges come up. And the last one that I wanted to speak to was Reconciliation, Healing the Inner Child. I think it goes along with a lot of the similar values of restorative justice. And Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk that's passed away in January this year, has been known for a lot of advocacy for peace, environmentalism, and racial and other kinds of social justice practices. So having recently passed, thought it would be meaningful, since this is so interrelated, for him to kind of be the corner of this work and process. So like we've talked about previously, social cultural transference and context. Most group theories, again, like any modalities, tend to have a more Eurocentric origin. This is not the case with restorative justice, although the restorative justice, as it's been talked about and written about, has largely been from white folks, like in the books that I discussed previously, which I think Howard Zur and others do a pretty good job of like really acknowledging the roots, and that this isn't like something that's new by them, portrayed to be resold. And there are a lot of efforts to mention like where these practices come from and how you can kind of honor them. So as we talked about before, different group theories and articles tend to be colorblind and not use different factors in identifying clients, and as well as the leaders, which tend to leave out a big variable. And when we're talking about intergroup dialogues, like in restorative justice practices, there's some structure to this that kind of prevents some of these things from being as problematic. But I'll still attempt to discuss cases and other examples through an identity-focused frame for context. And again, if there's any comments or things you believe I missed, microaggressions or others, then feel free to email me and let me know. I'm happy to get the feedback for that. So the big overview, if we're trying to talk about restorative justice practices for the too long didn't watch, is that really the goal is to own the warrior side of you, the side of you that advocates for change. This isn't like a violent warrior type. And the healer side, which has compassion for the supposed other. And when I say supposed other is just skipping ahead to the third line. This is really a shift in mindset, because a lot of what different restorative justice ideology discusses is this idea of shifting from individualism to a sense of interconnectedness. And that takes a lot of forms. I'll just use the Thich Nhat Hanh word that he used called interbeing, which essentially goes to this idea of the view of the self, or the ego, compared to the view of the non-self, meaning that everything is interconnected with one another. Lots of group theorists talk about this too. So like if you look at object relations, they often talk about how human relations are what makes us us. And so this is really taking it from the idea of, if we just treated humans kind of like we did all of nature, we would recognize that, when you look at a flower and you look deeply at what a flower is, it's made up of all non-flower elements: chlorophyll, water, soil, sunlight. That is what accumulates a flower. Much in the same way, each of us, we are an accumulation of all of our non-us parts. So our culture, our family, the relationships that we have, the interactions we have with others, even our body, our chemistry. These are not things that we choose. These are not things that we are, responsible for having. For me, as someone with ADHD, less dopamine firing. It's not a switch that I toggled. So all of that helps to kind of have us be more compassionate and curious, and wanting to lean into understanding how things happen and why things happen, rather than shifting to a more singular self where this person's responsible and they made a good choice or a bad choice. It takes the entire environment into account so that you can understand and reconcile. And that doesn't always mean that things go back to the same, but the kind of three pillars that restorative justice practice tends to focus on are harms and needs. So who was harmed, what was harmed, how can it be repaired, obligations. They're very big on accountability. So who is responsible and accountable, and how can they repair the harm? But again, like even in restorative justice practices, there are various different lenses, like more Eurocentric-esque lenses to more Afrocentric lenses. And so when we say responsible and accountable, how can they repair the harm? Some practices could be talking about the individual to the individual, like the victim to the perpetrator. But I think if we're really leaning into the Afrocentric, the like interconnectedness, this is really about when one suffers, we all suffer. And so this is kind of a way for them to repair and heal the community, which they're a part of. They can't be removed from. And engagement. So victims and offenders, again, have active roles in the justice process. So the people that are affected by a crime can be multi-layered, right? Not just the person, but the person's friends, families, coworkers. And again, even the person who committed the crime, you can be curious about what led to that behavior. There's a difference in the way we view things individualistically, where this, it's almost like we kind of take this idea that humans are bad by nature. And I like to use the idea of, again, if we're really thinking of humans like any other part of nature, I've never met a bad rose. I don't see roses as wicked, even if they have thorns and they cut. Like I don't think a rose is lazy or neurotic. I think the rose is doing its best with the environment that it's been given. And so if we kind of look at that and say, well, if this person's like desire at their core is to connect, is to be in connection with others, and they're not, they're turning to using a substance or enacting this crime, then what is it that's happened to them that's made them feel like this is the best way, the only way maybe that they know that they can get their needs met? So again, takes that idea of the self as the point of blame and shame into something that's more system focused and compassion focused. So sort of justice is meant to not be used in isolation of everything else. In terms of it's the idea that it being used as a replacement to our punitive system is not what anyone really advocates for within this. It's meant to be used incrementally. It's meant to be used alongside current systems. It's taking a stance of like, this is the value that we have. like that we all want to be in community with one another. And so like, I'll be talking a lot about counseling centers within this frame, just as it's my basically my best point of reference for a working environment with this. So with that, if somebody messes something up or does something hurtful within the counseling center, we all want to have a value around, look, we're here, we care about the students, we care about having a sense of community and about diversity and respecting and honoring diverse identities. And so how do we use that as our compass to navigate us through, to connect back with one another if we get lost, if we disconnect and we lose sight of the impact that the self has on the other, and use that as a guiding principle as opposed to, again, like a binary rule of right and wrong and good and bad, like in that. So the 5 principles, again, that kind of go with that, the 5 R's that's been referenced in different work is being in good relationship, having respect for one another, holding people responsible, focusing on repair and reintegration. The idea is that we can't exile or kick someone out of the group, because if we do, then again, there's this sense that all of us suffer when we lose someone like that. And so I think about this with racial dialogues, specifically, and the idea that if somebody commits a microaggression, which again wasn't that long ago, like maybe 3 years, 2 years, it's not long ago that I was very unaware and not as read about the different injustices that have happened in this country since George Floyd in 2020, like kind of raised my consciousness more to it. And so, when I think about the things that I did that were hurtful, that were microaggressive, thinking about if we exile someone for not knowing any more than the environment has given them, which they were not responsible for, they didn't ask for, then what are we gaining by that? How are we getting us closer to connecting and seeing each other, seeing the self and other is not so separate, if we're pushing people out into that? Again, though, it's not a binary where we always reintegrate, but I think that's the core principle that we're striving towards in that. Like I said, this is not meant to replace the justice system or never have somebody locked away, but it is something that I think RJ advocates would highly strive to reintegrate most folks who aren't unable to provide that kind of recovery within the social or community settings that they're in. So that's the large overview. We'll jump into the actual theory itself. So again, I'm going to do kind of a 2-part thing here. I'm going to try to do the spiritual / values focused overview of a restorative justice frame, and then talk about circle processes and what that pragmatically looks like. And then I'm also going to reflect on some implications of implementing restorative justice practice within university counseling centers. My hope, as I use different examples, and I tried to write some down from, I lead a lot of consultation groups within college counseling centers with group coordinators specifically. So my hope is to use a bunch of different examples that folks have given me anonymously to be able to help provide us some perspective and maybe think about, well, if we were going to approach this from a more restorative justice lens, how could this look? Not as a map, where there's a step-by-step process, but again, more as a compass towards something different than the individualistic system that we are all in the US with. So again, the warriors and healers. In this context, the warrior is more about holding power and compassion. And I'd say it's kind of akin to what the Buddhist concept of a bodhisattva is. Bodhisattva is somebody who has awakened and is aware of the suffering of the world, has been enlightened, but returns back to society in order to advocate and make change within the world through their power and tenacity. I think Buddhists often get this idea of, and this probably again maybe applies to RJ in some ways as well, that it's a very passive style, or that it's meant to not be confrontational. But I think again, to confront someone with relentless compassion and love and a desire to connect, I think is more of what it's advocating for, as opposed to like this very, you hurt me, so I'm going to hurt you back. So that's kind of what they mean when they say warrior healer, is meant to convey not so much the doctor healing the human body, but focusing on it from a social and spiritual context, because it's kind of in our human nature to be connected and to be in loving community with one another. That is how humans are meant to be, as we've seen by various different studies. There was some unspeakable experiments during World War II, where I believe it was the Germans who took children and tried to experiment to see if they gave them all the food and nourishment and warmth with blankets and everything that they needed, but they limited human touch as much as possible, trying to make, I suppose, more like emotionless soldiers to do their bidding. Then that could be maybe a better soldier than they currently had. But they found that sadly, all the babies that they did that with passed away. Their spines literally shriveled, and it's kind of self-destructive because we need that. We need to have the warmth and touch of a loving connection to others. And I don't think that grows out of us when we're children to adults, although I think most of society stigmatizes our emotional side of our experiences. And if we can kind of take that as our key crux of what it is that we need to be seen, we need to be validated, we need to be held with our emotional reality that we hold, then you can see how the healer is meant to kind of honor that and see that and view that within this practice. So the first 40 years of restorative justice within the West, again, has kind of focused on it very broadly, and for all people, hasn't really focused on the differences in identities with race and restorative justice. And so although implementing it in schools has been really helpful, because it has significantly reduced suspensions in the schools within, I believe, Minnesota and Oakland and other different specific cities within the US where they've practiced this. It hasn't had as grand of an effect on the percentage of people by race that have been suspended, which I think, probably again just speaks to the inherent bias within each of us, that implicit bias that we hold that needs more intentional focus. And I'm sure, again, that can be extended to other aspects outside of race as well, for different intersectional identities. Again, when we kind of think about the US and the history of it, it was based on two historic traumas. There's the genocide and displacement of indigenous folks and the enslavement of Black African-American people for profit. And that transgenerational trauma has kind of continued to be reenacted throughout time in different ways. Even though racism and slavery, for example, is not something that exists anymore. Well, racism does, slavery does not exist, as it did back then. But the ways that's kind of transferred, and I think it's Sonia Renee Taylor from the Body's Not an Apology that kind of highlighted this for me, is that the criminal justice system and the way that we treat criminals and take away their rights and make it so that they're very disenfranchised is essentially a new way of categorizing folks so that they will not be empowered to be able to be healed and to kind of reintegrate into society. We are a culture right now that says more of the code of Hammurabi, like an eye for an eye, rather than trying to be in compassion or curiosity and understanding as to what things pulled someone to do such a thing, and how can we help them get their needs met and reintegrate into society. There is a lot of good and evil kind of dichotomy right now with that. And that goes with the ways that we view white folks, Black folks, stereotypically within the culture. So restorative justice as a paradigm, strongly relational. It very much honors ancestors, lineage, land. And so it's part of why I think when you hear folks talking about being, for myself, on the land of the Lumbee tribe, the indigenous Lumbee tribe, we try and honor the land that we're on because it isn't our land. It came from somewhere and it had a history to it, and I benefit from it. Even though it's not something that I enacted, it's something that this country has granted me by proxy of being here. And so being able to hold that in our consciousness is not about like just wallowing in shame, but kind of honoring the suffering and the hurt that's come with this, and trying to see that and hold that as we, hold compassion and a desire to connect with one another now. So like I mentioned before, the three pillars of restorative justice: the harms, needs, who's harmed, how can it be repaired, what was the harm, who's responsible and accountable, and then how do you integrate victims and offenders with having an active role. That we'll go under a little more detail soon with that. But I'm going to try and go through some different like dichotomies and binaries to help us shift from this individualistic centered view to something that's more restorative in nature. So again, like this idea of individualism and independence compared to something that is more interdependent and collectivistic. There are plentiful amount, and I think it's on another slide, of spiritual practices that highlight our human interconnectedness over time. So it's not just Afrocentric or Buddhism theories, but like really so many different ones. And again, the difference in ontology, that humans are inherently bad, sinful, full of primal impulses by nature. And so you can kind of see how psychoanalytic, modern analytic theories kind of take part of this ontology and thinking about the id and those primal, like killing and sex, like that's the primal impulses that they kind of like discuss, when they're talking about folks managing their own destructive impulses. But the ontology of an Afrocentric kind of model would highlight humans are inherently good by nature. And again, like, when I think about that, I think that idea of, well, if no baby's born in this world hating themselves, again, this is another Renee Taylor like thing that kind of helped me understand it. No baby's born thinking that their body doesn't look good. They're not born thinking the skin color isn't as pretty as other people. We're okay. We play with our bodies. We, kind of explore the world, explore ourselves. It's not something that has stigma attached to it until we start to get these strings from these systems around us. And those strings start to, like, kind of like a marionette, pull us to sway and dance and act a certain way, so that we are accepted, so that we're connected. That once unconditional nourishment that we got from being connected to our mothers now has conditions, now has reasons for us to be pulled to act this way, think this way, be thinner, be wider, be better, be more motivated. And those, again, like, hold many different paradoxes and expectations over time from our society, from our culture, and they don't even have to be told to us directly. We can just take them in as the message from the systems. But that kind of pulls us to adapt in the best way that we can. So Menicum from My Grandmother's Hands, which is a really wonderful book on racial trauma in the bodies of Black, white, and even police bodies. I think he kind of highlights the idea of, so white folks, if you look at the colonial history and in Europe, the kinds of defenestration and things that people saw others go through within public squares, there was a need to almost like numb ourselves to the suffering of that, because they weren't necessarily people of color that were being like killed in that. But even, with that, and then shifting into slavery, where there were a lot of Christians that found justification to like hold slaves back then, there had to be a disconnect, because the teachings of Jesus don't coincide with the use of slavery. And so there was a desire and a need to be able to adapt and numb ourselves to the suffering of the other, to see ourselves as different from them. And then that numbness, that unawareness, that sense of this can't be really happening, or it's being exaggerated, or, I've never done things like that, the defensiveness, that all serves a purpose too. And that's not to like villainize that. But again, like if we take every behavior, every feeling as adaptive, as meaningful, then we start to understand like, oh, this is why it's hard for maybe folks to come to terms or to recognize this, is that it's really held in our bodies to need to push it away. And vice versa with Black folks and others, where they react to the police in that way. There's things within the culture and the families that they've learned, as well as like intergenerationally, I forget exactly where this video was, but there was a really striking, I think, Black woman researcher who talked about this post-traumatic slave syndrome, I believe, where she essentially talked about how a Black mother and a white mother would all talk about their kids differently. Like the white mother would praise their kids as doing a good job, and even if the white mother noticed and said like, "Oh, your son actually did better than mine," because the Black mother would also praise the white child. But when the attention was brought to the Black mother's child, she'd say, "No, he's not. He's not that smart, or like, he's kind of a pain. He's pain. He doesn't listen. He'll never, he just won't get it together." Like, we think, why would they do that? Why would they say those kinds of things? And then when you look back at the idea of slavery and history, where Black women with their young children in the cotton fields, like picking, if a white slave owner like talked to them and said, "Oh, your boy looks really fit," or "He looks like he's strong enough and ready to go work," they would say, "No, he's weak. He's frail. He can barely carry anything." So again, it was adaptive to cut down their esteem, their view of their worth, like within that. But that context, is different now, but the undercurrent emotionally is the same. And so now there's this like undercurrent of needing to put oneself down and kind of lower ourselves in the minds of those around us, maybe without recognizing the effect that it has, because that child has no sense of why is mom being so mean to me, or just like takes it in and takes it personally, right? They have no context other than the life that they have. They just feel that sinking like shame or sadness. So there's many different examples that you could like spring from this in terms of like, again, how people have adapted to their environment, but it helps, I think, and again, in terms of, if it's not about a choice, if it's not just about like, oh, you just made a bad choice or you're a bad person, which is a very like simplistic thing. I think of like literally, again, any other animal. I have 2 dogs here, which I hope don't bark during this conversation. But if they bark and they, do something that I don't like, it's not because they're evil. It's because that they haven't been like trained, or they haven't been in environments that have supported them to understand what they need to do or what I want them to do to be better suited for, recording videos. So with that, again, the difference with our culture currently is one that focuses more on threats, punishment, and using fear as a method of changing people. We currently have a crisis with Ukraine and the invasion of that from Russia, from Putin specifically. And so again, like there's some people that argue like we need to be more threatening, we need to threaten to punish them and have more fear based in that. And again, like that, in my mind, tends to escalate those kinds of things. When we threaten and punish people, it doesn't tend to, and I think most like parenting and other kinds of ways in which we talk about negative reinforcements doesn't really support that for change. And again, like the idea of like wanting to fight for and push for nonviolent solutions, focusing on connection, love, and understanding need for reparations is kind of the shift that we're speaking to. It's not, again, to say that there isn't a place and time for like each of these things. It's not like they're right and wrong. I know it may seem like that in the way that I'm talking about it, but I'm really just trying to help us kind of think about this differently from a different kind of frame of the world. So again, that more Roman justice code of Hammurabi, eye for an eye, way of hurting people that hurt people, as opposed to thinking like, how do we engage in restorative practices to have people heal as much as they're able to, and to have them kind of have reparations in that way, and compassion for one another. The worldview that is taken from like older, like our Eurocentric constructs, is control of the others through decisions is made by a third party, like a judge, lawyers. And then from a more Afrocentric phrase, all the parties and all the people involved in the community make decisions equally. Now, again, like the difference with Afrocentric, like, focused communities as opposed to Eurocentric communities now, we live very separate lives, very separatist, like kind of ideals. Like I've been here for a little over a year in North Carolina, and I don't know any of my neighbors, like really. I mean, we've talked a few times, but certainly not a sense of community that I think historically humans would be more interconnected within that like larger expanded community. So I think context is everything, and that's something as we're implementing these practices, we can't just use it as a map, but hopefully again, it gives us that direction of what we want to do. The difference between things being objective and intersubjective, I think, is really big with a lot of different group theories, as well as like restorative justice. So objective means that there's an interpretation, there's a truth here that we're trying to seek. There's a way to look at this correctly, a right, a wrong, a cause and an effect. And that's very different from more Eastern practices and within restorative justice frames as well, as of wanting to honor each person's intersubjective truth, their felt experience. I really think that idea of the binaries, I used to say breaking binaries of emotional narratives, but I really think the more that I'm reading about Taoism and other Eastern practices, it's really more about bonding those binaries, like taking the line, the rope that seems like separate ends, and then connecting them to make a circle. Because a lot of the emotional experiences that we have, and as well as like a lot of the ways that things occur in life, have a ebb and flow to them, a wave to them. So picturing that yin and yang symbol as a way of saying like things are interdependent on one another, and one thing is here because another thing is there. They mutually kind of arise with one another, rather than thinking about one of them as the problem that needs to change and the other one as the victim and receiver in that. So the self being the main focus of change and the measure of success. Again, like we've talked about, a lot of things in psychology today are focused on an ego, a concrete self that is abstractly separate from the world around it. But we would never, again, blame a flower for wilting in a drought. We would understand that if a flower is wilting, then we want to ask, like, what happened to it? And what does it need now that it's not getting its environment? But we don't treat humans in that way, right? We see ourselves as separated from our environments and have this idea that we are the illness, we are the problem. But if we make these constructs that we say are objective, like mental illness, let's say, when we call something depression, and we say, I have depression, I have a mental illness, then we're essentially, if we broke down what depression means, and we look at what it is made of, it's made up of feeling irritated, feeling hopeless, feeling lonely, and then physiological sensations, right? Low energy, and maybe other kinds of like different phenomena. Those things are responses to the environment, not things that happen where our brain just misfires and we're just broken. But I think the way that psychology has shifted from a more philosophical approach of exploring and spiritually kind of understanding why we are the way we are, why we've needed to be the way we are, to something that's more clinical, to something that's more objective, binary, diagnosable, it comes at a cost. And that cost is really assuming that we are in control of the things that happen around us. Because if emotions are an outside-in thing, and we can't control the outside, then when we blame ourselves for depression, or when we feel like guilty that we're anxious, then we recognize that actually what we're doing is blaming the flower, right? And that we're not looking at the idea of what do I need? What are the systems giving me? And actually, like, what are my feelings representing, right? Because to feel like hopeless, I think, is something where we think, man, I really need to be less hopeless. And that kind of, again, puts the onus on us, as opposed to like, oh, I'm in a job or an internship or an environment where it feels very hopeless at times in terms of how much work we have to do at university counseling centers and how much we have to take on with a never-ending demand on us. And so that hopelessness actually isn't mine. I'm actually feeling what the environment is energizing and kind of shifting towards me. And that's just my experience of it. So the idea of a non-self view is actually really fascinating, and I highly recommend, again, Thich Nhat Hanh as a way to delve deeply and think deeply on understanding this. Because if you start to think about the self can't be responsible for the self-inflicted things, that our self is a reflection of others, what others have done to us, then every voice that we hear that criticizes ourselves, every feeling that we have negatively towards ourselves, if that can't be us, if there isn't such a thing as self-esteem, because no one just chooses their esteem. If I see my daughter holding a puzzle up to me, who's 3.5, and she says like, "Daddy, I did a puzzle," and I say, "Great job, buddy, so proud of you." I give her esteem. She gets higher esteem with that. If I ignore her, or I say, "Not now, I'm too busy," then she feels deflated. She feels lower esteem, right? So it feels like a very simple, like, of course, that's what it is construct. But I think for me, it's been really important to recognize how much of that I still reinforce with the language that I use and the way that I talk to myself or talk to my daughter or others. I really focus a lot on emotional binaries and trying to bond them and recognize the purpose of them. So if my daughter, again, tries to do something like she's, I don't know, sticking a toy into the electrical socket, and I get angry and I shout, "Sonia, stop it," right? Like she freezes up in fear, but that fear isn't hers. I'm scared, I'm terrified, something's gonna happen to her, and I'm angry and shouting, but that's really only the mechanism so that I can have her feel connected to my fear. So again, we kind of shift from this idea of oh wow, I really yelled and I was rude and I could have said things a different way, to understanding that I was terrified. I didn't know how else to have you understand that. And so sometimes we show, not tell one another how we feel. So again, opening ourselves up curiously to what's happening and how we are, and holding on to that inner goodness that all of us are doing our best with what we've had. And if I were you, born in your culture, born in your world, born in your family and your body, then I would be you. There wouldn't be a difference in that. There's not something that's inherently separating us, that we are extensions of the environment around us. So with that comes a sense of, from the Eurocentric view, we desire certainty. We want there to be, a sense of rigidity where we can explain things, a more perfectionistic ideal. Whereas the Eastern practices, Hinduism and others, tend to embrace uncertainty as a virtue, curiosity, focusing on less happily ever after, more meaningful ever after, right? When we're talking about phenomena, and then exploring rather than explaining. So that leads to us focusing on are we wanting to control our emotions? Are we seeing the emotions as the problem? If we call it depression, are we really saying I shouldn't be irritated, I shouldn't be lonely, I shouldn't be this? As opposed to saying well, if the emotions are the wind, then I need to feel them fully. I need to understand what they're pushing me towards, which they're pushing me away from. And even if they're pushing me away from something, I can use that wind to my advantage if I'm sailing, right? That it's not just this is bad and unhelpful, but something that I can use really tactfully. So with that, instead of thinking of it as this person made a good choice or a bad choice, we're really trying to have people tell their stories, raise up counter narratives, and deepen our understanding for one another. This doesn't mean that we remove emotions, though. Again, I think sometimes people get caught in this idea that there's emotions that are good that we need to be, and emotions that are bad that we need to get away from. So if you think of it as yin and yang, again, we want to stay in the yin. We never want to be in yang. And when we're in yang, we think, how can I get back to yin? This is about being fully with yang, and kind of like the sun and moon. I don't know where the sun goes every night or where the moon goes when it's light, but I don't mind as long as they're back in time, right? The idea is these things cycle. They are indicative of the environment and the world around us. And if we could have enough trust and enough presence in our life to recognize those cycles, recognize the yin and yang as it happens to us, instead of thinking that, aha, I made the yin happen, I made this occur. You can start to recognize well, what in your environment was pulling you to do that, which is pulling you to feel differently in this context, as opposed to thinking like you're the reason for your success. You pulled your bootstraps up, great job. And you're also the reason for every time you fail. So that's shifting from that to something that's more system-centered in our view. So that was a lot, but I feel like you really need that context if you're going to do restorative justice practices. You can't just run a circle process and assume everything will change. You really have to continuously reflect and educate yourself with awareness towards the different spiritual and emotional, I think, stances that restorative justice models and those kinds of spiritual practices take place and compared to where we are. So, and again, like even other religious types, just feel like it's important to mention, like I'd alluded to earlier, the teachings of Jesus, like specifically, those are very aligned with that of Buddhism. And it's not like there is a Christian, anti-Christian thing with this either. I think different religions and like religious constructs tend to like maybe pull people further away and more into this like retribution, punitive mindset. But if you look at its core, that's there in that, in Judaism, in all the other like major religions. There's a lot of focus in the Quran, like on peace, and like anything, it can be taken out of its context and kind of pulled to be used for ill gains. But with the history of restorative justice movements within the country, there's been a couple different models. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but I think it's just helpful to recognize the South African model after apartheid. There was a very historic, and I just forgot the person's name, but there was a person that was very instrumental in implementing this practice within there that I would recommend looking up. He has quite a few books to just kind of reference. But that was essentially where the government was not the primary focus, but there was a desire for a spirit of forgiveness and a kind of individualized spirit of that from the top down. So the government really pushing that for the community to embrace. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, again, another top-down process. There was a history within Canada of taking Aboriginal children away from homes, forcing them into schools that were more Eurocentric, you know, in that process, and taking them away from the things that they held as values in their cultures. And they actually partnered with indigenous folks impacted by history to be able to make reparations and amends with that. Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission, my understanding in North Carolina was that there was some police that were exonerated after they let a mob kill 5 Black folks, like from a mob of white supremacists. They'd kind of let that go. And then there was a ton of research done in terms of what was needed in terms of reparations, making a museum to kind of honor those people and really educate the world, the world and like the schools within North Carolina to understand this and what happened, the tragedies, so that it doesn't happen again. But despite all the policies provided, that was ultimately rejected by lawmakers. So again, if you don't have the top, the administration, like bought in to these practices, it can be very tough, like from the bottom up, to make any change, which we'll like speak about more in detail as we go on. MWTRC, I believe, is similar to the Canada one, where in Maine they forced assimilation of indigenous children. And then there was a desire to be both provided education and they provided some systemic reformation like for that, done in collaboration with others. The goal again is to do justice with people like who have been hurt or harmed, rather than not to them. And so if somebody is perpetrated, how do they take responsibility, accountability, so that they can make amends and bring us closer back to being connected with one another. There's this idea of subsidiary involvement, which just means basically wherever the injury is happening, decisions need to be made at the lowest level, bottom up, to help raise counter narratives. So like if you're at a counseling center and something happens where a staff member makes a off-cuff comment to an intern or trainee, you want to be able to meet the trainee and kind of like provide them support and empowerment, like to help them like make an informed decision on what they need to be taken care of, make amends. And I think like for me, I'm just going to use my own internship for that. There's different value like in this, right? Like I remember having a pretty aggravated experience with the clinical director at the time, who I was with because of some like conflicts, being an internal candidate to the center. And I was asked to really talk to them, reach out to repair alone. And I remember that feeling very intimidating, very nervous and scary. And, you know, it was something that I think from the individualistic lens, you think you need to learn how to do these things for yourself. You need to be independent because no one else will do this for you. And again, that's kind of the message that I got and what I did, and it went okay. I don't know that I was really feeling that validated by the experience actually, but the point is it's meant to affirm the self as being empowered as opposed to really emphasizing like, how can we make sure that you're really heard for this and that you're given due for the harm that's been done. And you know, you might have supportive allies or things that you need to help like manage that. Not just putting it on the person with the least power to make the change in that. The idea, again, like isn't a binary in that it should be bottom up always or top down. You really need people to mutually arise and mutually kind of like mix with one another so that you can get this work productively done. So again, like what is restorative justice not? It's not a panacea. It is not a new creation from North America. It's not a substitution that we should just wholesale use. It's not an alternative to prison. It's not a simple step-by-step process. And it's not the territory and not the map, just a compass of values with a circle process that's meant to help facilitate some connection and storytelling principles. So some of the principles of restorative justice, like we talked previously, we want to allow people to obtain information, why and how things happen from an offender, to tell their truth, to re-story in a way, because right now we have a narrative of what happened, and it's probably very, for both people, very one-sided. They did this because they don't give a shit. They did this because they don't see me as human. And we really want to understand both people's stories in that, so that we recognize that the person who harmed has had harm, has had things that led them to act in such a way. And that it's also not, again, like flipping the blame, but having us kind of like reconnect when we've been pushed apart in that. Some questions that traditionally people use: what rules have been broken? Who did it? What do they deserve? That's the more like typical questions in Eurocentric culture. If you were shifting that to restorative justice, this would be saying, who's been hurt? What are their needs? Who's the responsibility to make things right, to restore relationships within the community? And again, like this interconnected thing, this isn't new. It's very much like throughout different cultures and spiritual belief. I apologize if I like butcher these pronunciations. The Hozo from the Navajo, the Shalom concept from Judaism, Wakapapa from the Maori, Ubuntu from South Africa, Tendril from Tibetan Buddhism, as well as interbeing, Thich Nhat Hanh's term from Zen Buddhism. All of these kind of focus on the interconnectedness of humanity and that spiritual oneness. And I think even Jung, like you can talk about the collective unconscious, there's a lot of allusions to this in different ways. And those interrelationships create mutual obligations and responsibilities. So if we start to recognize that the self and other are not disconnected, if what I feel is actually an extension of what you're feeling, then you affect me, I affect you. So when one of us suffers, we all suffer. And it helps all of us to be in holding community together. You know, when we lose someone at the counseling center because they take a step back into private practice, they feel burnt out. It affects us all. Like, and it's important for us to honor that and understand that impact that the person has, even if not everybody was at the same level of friendship with a person. It's important to kind of make meaning of how does this sit with us? What does it impact? And maybe what parts of us did we see in that person, again, so that we can identify with the loss there. So The foundations, like we talked about, being in relationship, having respect, responsibility, and repairing and reintegrating folks, like, are kind of things that you can have a shorthand for restorative justice practices. So as we talk about circle processes, there's a lot of different circle process iterations, but in a peacemaking circle, everyone's respected, everyone gets a chance to talk without interruption. Participants explain themselves by telling their stories one by one. Everyone's equal, no one's more important than another, and spiritual and emotional aspects of experiences are welcome. And we really want to use structures to enhance freedom to express themselves. I think this is super important because oftentimes we try and view things again like as to discriminate between this and that. And I think as a group coordinator, there are decisions that I can make that can make things more equitable, right? And as a facilitator, I think we see this all the time. Right? If I do nothing, if I treat everyone the same, that doesn't make it a space where people feel welcome and belong. Like as a white male, I don't mention anything about race. People default to what their socio-cultural norm is, which is we don't talk about race most of the time in this country. And so if we're not going to talk about that, then it's not going to feel safe to talk about it. Like they have no sense that I'm aware of any person's plight. Similarly, we do this with emotions all the time, right? Like we don't say, okay, we're here to talk in group. We say, think and feel out loud. We want people to emphasize that, hey, you may not have believed this or been taught this throughout your life, but for us, emotions are important and we're going to focus more on that here. So there is no neutral objective thing. We're always taking a stand. We're always relative to some value system. So wanting to recognize that equality is not equity, is not justice. Again, I think sometimes, just speaking in counseling centers, there can be this pendulum swing where it's like, oh, we did all hierarchies and all things were made by a singular person, and that was awful. That's white supremacy, and so we need to swing it and always do things by group, like by focusing on group as a whole, decision making, and making sure everybody's voice is equally respected. And if somebody says no, then we can't go forward. Even some of the circle processes like talk about that, like coming to a full consensus. But there's more nuance than just that. And again, sometimes there do need to be value decisions made by individuals to support the more equitable and connected constructs. Now, that doesn't mean it should be taken for granted or shouldn't be examined or brought to like curiosity and interrogated in its own way. But I think, again, not wanting to think of like, oh, well, just treat everyone equally and all things work out. Like, these things always have contextual layers to them. We want to use structures to enhance freedom to express ourselves. I invite folks, for example, to talk about their group ideas, and they work collaboratively with me so that we can flesh it out and really create like maybe a new group for the center. If I didn't invite that, there wouldn't be maybe as much freedom to express. So it's important that I made that choice to say, hey, this is important, and I'm going to like reintegrate this every summer to encourage people to talk to me so that they can have more opportunities for that. So take time to establish safety first and foremost. We need to meet as humans before coworkers. When I do check-ins, I often say, like in my consult groups, how are you doing as a human? How are you doing as a group facilitator, as a group coordinator, as a group-related person in the world? And then what do you have on your agenda? Agenda comes last. Humanness comes first. The humanity and productivity, like weights, we're trying to like tip those scales in that way. Trust building, sharing traits, values, or personal contributions, like while holding respect for one another, is key. And we want to reflect on what issues occurred, who was affected, and how, as well as discuss solutions as a group, reflect on thoughts in the future as we close. So that's the broad overview of the circle process. So a little bit more, just again, in terms of the setup. Typically, pre-corona, you can do this over Zoom, of course, but if you're going to be starting to meet in person with COVID, then just thinking about setting up a circular amount of chairs. Oftentimes there are objects that symbolize values of the group in the center as a reminder of what each of us stand for. And so whoever's bringing the circle to form would probably be the person to start placing some objects in the middle, but you'd want to invite multiple folks to put in like maybe a, I don't know, like a thank you card from a student or a flower representing growth and potential from someone's office, something to have a, like in the center wheel, there's a spoke in the center of a wheel or a campfire that we sit around. Again, there's some symbolism to the unified circle with a central source of nourishment, whether that's the warmth from the heat or again, that interconnects us and helps us move forward, like in that wheel. So wanting to focus on shared leadership, equality, connection, inclusion, focus, accountability, everyone participating. There's a certain ceremony that we want to have at the beginning of this. We really want people to feel like, okay, we are coming into a circle and this is purposeful and intentional. So whether that's something where you ring a little bell to like get everyone to refocus in, or you just kind of do some readings from a diverse identified, like maybe a person in history or someone that's meaningful to you within the field. That can be a really meaningful way to start off a ceremony circle process. There's a talking piece, something that is used, and it can be really any object, but something that is held by a person, and while that person is holding that piece, they're the only one allowed to speak. They hold the undivided attention of everyone else in the group while they're holding the speak and talking, holding the piece and talking. You also want to have a facilitator or a keeper of some kind of the circle. You want to set some guidelines, and consensus decision-making is often used, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. But the focus is again on multitudes of dimensions: the spiritual, the emotional, the physical, the mental. The ceremony is used to open and close the sacredness of the space, and we want guidelines for safety. We want, for example, people to recognize that anybody can ask for the bell to be like rung, because by giving everybody that power and choice, if the circle feels off track, or if it feels like we're losing the thread of like what we're trying to stay on task with, or if we're losing connectedness with one another, then we can call that to take a breath as you hear the bell ring, like, and bring yourself back to center, bring yourself back to the present, and reconnect with those in the room. So that's something that I believe the Circle Way talked about, that they learned from Thich Nhat Hanh as a way of really balancing this process. There's also a scribe sometimes that can be had in these spaces, where you can have someone who writes down the main points from others in the group, and these roles of like who's the keeper of the circle, who's the maybe the person that monitors or holds the bell, and if someone asks to invite the bell to sound, remember, we don't strike the bell because we're not violent, we're inviting the bell to produce sound for us. Then you can have multiple roles within the circle to help manage the cohesion and the sanctity of that space. The idea of storytelling over advice is that we're really, circles can have different processes, of course, but I think it's really meant to humanize us and connect us rather than to be a very productive means. It is not more productive to do a circle than to do a staff meeting. However, most of the time, being productive is not ever going to end within a counseling center system, for example, where productivity is infinite, where there is always going to be more demand than there is supply for counselors and their time. So at some point, there needs to be a place in which we say this is enough productivity, and we set aside time for our humanity and our health and our growth as clinicians, as staff, to interconnect, to feel held and supported in community, rather than putting in an extra intake or an extra crisis. And this is, again, multi-layered. I'm not an admin, so I'm sure there's many different aspects that can be considered in that piece, but that's the thing is, these things are not just residing with one person. When there's pressure from the very, very top, and that gets done to admin, and that gets down to us, all of us feel the isomorphy, the pressure at the top coming down, even from the lowest level, like where people are brand new master's level interns, we can feel that. So wanting to focus on ways to reconnect with our human experience is vital in these spaces. Types of circles, there can be talking ones, understanding, healing, sentencing, support, community building, conflict, reintegration, celebration. Really, again, just trying to focus on the purposefulness of the circle and what your goal is in undertaking it, I think is key. I encourage folks, again, to look at the books for more detailed descriptions in the different subgroups of circles, but we're going to focus on really two main types here. So before the circle, we tend to set an invitation to folks with an intention of the meeting and helping them prepare for what's going to be talked about or what's going to be discussed. Then you want to establish a frame, set the stage, initiate with a brief reading or script of your choice, a meditation or a meaningful speech from diverse backgrounds. I'll use a speech right now to illustrate this. Like, I really love Thich Nhat Hanh in the Reconciliation book, talks about the wisdom of non-discrimination. And to encapsulate it as best I can, say, if we're really wanting to work through our tendency to discriminate this and that from right and wrong, from the self and other, then we really need to embrace the wisdom of non-discrimination, which is a natural wisdom that we all have. My left hand and my right hand have the wisdom of non-discrimination. My right hand writes poetry, writes letters, but it never feels superior to my left hand. It never turns to my left hand and says, left hand, I do all the work. I'm the one who's carrying all the utensils to the mouth. Like, you don't do anything. Like, what's your problem, right? The left hand doesn't get jealous or envious of my right hand. They recognize that if I'm doing some act, then I need both of them to work in harmony to be able to fully produce and be in that like beauty interconnectedness. Sometimes though, whether again, we're thinking about being in dialogues about race or just thinking of ourselves, we can harm one another without recognizing it, right? So like my right hand and left hand, if I'm holding a nail with my left hand and I'm holding a hammer with my right, and I'm not mindful of something, and I strike my left hand instead of the nail, what happens? I immediately drop the hammer and my right hand holds and soothes my left hand, healing it and holding it, the pain that it holds, as if it was its own, because it is its own. They are different, they are not the same. Although one person was struck and the other person striked them with an object, they both suffer. And so healing is a responsibility of the one that caused the harm as well. So as we go into the circle today, I want us to hold on to that idea that we are all working towards our natural wisdom of non-discrimination that's in each of us. That's something you could use like as a way of opening up the circle process. And to me, it sets a tone, kind of highlights our desire to be interconnected, to recognize that, yes, we cause harm, but we both want the best for each of us to be in harmony. And, as you do that, you can focus in on setting the role, who's going to be the facilitator, who's going to be the scribe, who's going to be the bell keeper in that way, or the guardian of the circle, so that you can have responsibility for managing the circle's dynamics, or if it goes, again, too off track, or if we lose touch with one another. Place items in the center, encourage them to bring their valuable, encourage people to bring their items to the center that are value-centric to them. And then I like this line that was talked about in the book. As we engage in this process, I want us to imagine a larger circle of diverse students we serve that encompass around us and are watching us as we talk. Keep in mind that they're looking at us, and we want to model our commitment to honesty, connection, integrity with them as we talk. Because again, like I think it can be easy to lose sight of what we all are really here for. And this can be different for each of your jobs, but for counseling centers, we're here for like helping students, helping growth, helping people feel accepted, cared for, understood, and to reach their potential. And by that extension, to reach the potential of the world around us. So having them be around us also, I think, helps us be mindful and conscious that we're not just going to pass the anger or the dismissal on these students, these jerks, they don't know what they're doing, or like they're so annoying and overwhelming. We really want to recognize, again, they aren't the problem either. Like, they are doing the best with what they can during this pandemic, during the semester, during their tribulations and trials of their lives. So that's a helpful image, I think, to reinforce. We want to, again, like as much as possible, make this a safe place to share, hopefully to heal. And we want this to be different from staff meetings or remediation sessions. We don't want this to be done only when there is a tragedy or a rupture, right? If this is really something we're going to commit to, being in a restorative justice kind of frame and center, we need to commit to the monetary value that this is going to require. And what I mean by that is time. Time is money in counseling centers, and probably in other businesses too. So, for example, I would propose something where like you'd have an hour every Friday morning that everybody as a staff would commit to, like blocking out from any other like task or any other clinical contact, so that you can have that shared community and space to be able to have a consistent time where maybe it wouldn't always be a circle, maybe there would be a CE training, maybe there'd be other kinds of like staff primers, but that there would be this space that could be held each week, and that is expected to be held each week, to grow as a community and connection with one another, to be with our humanity in that. I think we need those kinds of spaces more than ever. And it's always going to feel like there's not enough time unless we make that time present for us, separate from staff meeting and agendas, because again, those can be very cumbersome. Listening deeply, speaking from the heart, respecting the talking piece when someone has it. And then the group is responsible for the circle as much as the circle keepers or the guardians are. And the bell, again, brings us back to center and makes us all take a breath with that bell in and out, so that we can re-engage with, okay, where are we right now? And what happened to let us get off track. So this is again, like me trying to give some steps, but please be creative and, use this not as the only way to do it, but as one way to give an example of it. The first round, you tend of circle process, because again, it just goes around in the circle one by one. The person speaks, whoever's holding the talking piece. They'll do an introduction, check in, and have some lighthearted questions. We're really focusing on connecting and being in that humanness with one another. So some good questions that I've just picked up over the years. What's the story of your name? If your name is significant or holds significance, can you let us know? I find that this is really meaningful. For me, Vincent is, I believe, something I was given because an uncle, Vincent, of my mother, passed away the same day I was born. And so I think that's what actually gave me that name. My middle name, Malik, is Algerian. It's from the indigenous Berber folks like in North Africa. And so that is something that I'm called when I visit overseas, and that means young prince. And Dihili, again, is from that Berber indigenous tribe back then. So that, to me, there can be a lot of meaning in stories. There can be a lot of silly anecdotes. It can be a really nice and meaningful way to just get in touch with the purposefulness of what our names represent, because names are usually pretty important, for us to hear, to understand, to pronounce correctly. And it's nice to be able to introduce people in that way. Asking, why are you here? What identities do you hold, or other ideas? The goal is to ease the tension, to provide a space to give context to people, to the current frame as they're entering into this process. And you take as long as you need for this first part to really focus on the connection and the safety building. The second round being really just about that, right? So I say first rounds because, again, you may need to do more than one question if it feels like the group isn't quite ready to transition into the second round. What do you need to feel safe in this process? Both your needs to be spoken, as well as what do you need to deepen your awareness of others, in this. The third round, they suggested recording on a piece of paper or an index card. Were you harmed by anybody in the center, like the counseling center in this year, for example? And did you knowingly inflict harm on anyone during this year? So I have a bit of a qualm with some of the wording here. Knowingly inflicting harm, that kind of gives me the idea of yes, and this will cause everyone pain, and I will make the intern cry later. I don't think, again, that that's what we're actually going for in here. So I would probably shift this to something and have you recognized your action caused harm to anyone during this year? Because it's about you recognizing the harm that you caused, the impact that you had, rather than your intent. Because I don't think, again, like, I don't think any of us subjectively have bad intent. I don't think that can exist. I think we always adapt to what we have in that. So that would be kind of some of the shift in that question I would just reflect on differently. But this is really designed to reflect on, again, your personal behavior as well as the impact on yourself, your family, your work relationships for a future circle session to possibly be shared. So this is again, a little bit different in setting up for a second circle session. But the fourth round, we want to do some takeaways or highlights from today's circle, share your hopes for the University Counseling Center over the next 3 months. So really in this, we're trying to focus on the meaningful experiences taken from the circle. This doesn't have to be positive. That's why it's a takeaway or a highlight in that. And you really want to notice and note the growth or the hope for the growth of the community moving forward, to kind of see where everyone's vision is pointing us to and how there can be those like alignments in that. And then for the next day, they say to set aside an entire day for the second circle. It's not something that I've done. Again, like, sadly, I haven't had a chance to facilitate these kinds of processes as of yet. But I think it's an interesting thing in terms of like really committing to having a first exposure to this process and a specific training before you start to integrate it within different aspects of the center as a whole. So the second circle, you have an initial reading. You reflect on the previous session's themes or takeaways, and then you emphasize the values items in the center of the circle again. You reflect on the image of the large student body sitting around you, watching you as you engage in this process to keep the big picture in mind. And then again, like, we want to check in, share how you're doing and how it feels to return to the circle this week. And the second round, we're going to explore, and this is going to take a substantial amount of time, but we're going to ask each person, what's the most stressful thing for individuals, for each person, and for your family during this past year? Sure, I can only imagine how much people have gone through in this last year during COVID's second year. And I think, if we really, the goal is to give people as much time as they need and not to rush, not to be a time keeper in this, hence setting aside an entire second day, a full day for the second circle process, because we really want to let people feel the safety and enough to have space to breathe. And it might be good to think about, again, like, who speaks first, where people are sitting in relation to one another, just in terms of like, what do we want to be modeled? And then how are we maybe modeling that so different folks have time to gather themselves or to like make their choice if they want to share or not. These are always invitations, they're not commands. And so like, you can't force somebody to share in a circle, nor should that like be like helpful, but people can have like feelings towards that and speak to that as well at different parts in the circle. The goal is not to dialogue, though. It's to speak about your felt experience singularly, and that may involve people around you. You may be talking about things that happened at work or with certain people within the group. But that's meant to be honored and seen like as a whole, as opposed to focusing on, having a dialogue back and forth and interrupting or trying to bring counterpoints to the person's view of things. So then after we've done this, what's the most stressful thing for you as a person and your family during this year? We want to ask like, and give people a chance to share their individual impact statements, how they're impacted, how they were perceived they were harmed, and then how they believe they've harmed others, their coworkers, through their actions. And then what do we need in order to move on? That can be a lot of different things that people speak to, right? Time, patience, understanding, forgiveness, etc. And we want to encourage people at this point, since they've heard folks that have pointed to them as part of the harm. Now you can encourage members to maybe set plans to address the harms for themselves, like as they hear others speaking. So the fifth round, what commitments do you as individuals want to make to help the program move forward? So again, like each of us taking accountability or responsibility for the whole space, as far as like how we help us, each of us move forward within this. So you can kind of see how this process may unfold very slowly. It is not meant to be, you do this and things are fixed, but it is a first step in a journey of focusing on connecting back with one another when we drift apart in these different spaces. So I wanted to give another overview of different like circle processes with respect to ruptures that happen. So if a person has been harmed, and a person is accused of harming like them, then they tend to be approached separately, like in this by maybe a third party at first. That could be an admin, that could be like maybe another staff member or staff members that have connections to them. But you want to speak to the person harmed and indicate their willingness to engage in restorative circle process. And like, you know, again, the lowest level, the person who's been harmed is kind of the foci of how you want to be guided in this. And then you want the person accused of harm to be asked if they can take a responsibility or accountability for the harm caused. And again, really trying to emphasize the difference between intent, which of course is always going to be good for everybody subjectively, and impact, which can vary subjectively based on how others like respond to one another. As a white person, again, like I can say something and it can hold a lot of strong valence and cause a lot of harm if I say it compared to maybe a person of color stating something. So really wanting to notice the difference in our identities that we hold and how they interplay within our intergroup dialogues in this topic. Members in the community who are less directly affected may be asked to engage with the circle process. So maybe like an intern is like harmed in some way, and so you'd want to involve the cohort of trainees if that's okay for the person who's been harmed, to involve them both for support and also maybe they're affected by the decision or the harm that's done. If there's like a specific, like, I don't know, consultation group where a harm happened, then maybe you want to involve the whole consult team around it. And you can also ask both parties if there are supportive members that may be brought in to support them while they're engaging in this process. The conference is not held if a person accused of harm denies responsibility, or if the one harmed does not choose to engage in the process. And the purpose, again, is to gather information to understand deeply why and how things happened from the person who caused harm, to truth tell from each person's experience, and to engage in restoring this narrative to honor the intersubjectivity of their experiences. That can be a very helpful way of going through this process. Again, some questions that you could ask during these more ruptures, and maybe this is more akin to a family group conference than an actual circle process, because it's like kind of between these two like individuals with some supportive figures around them. But we want to be able to ask what happened, who's been affected, and how do we make things right? And other things you can question to invite people to deepen their understanding and storytell. I just listed some below from different sources. What were you thinking about at the time that this happened? What have you thought about since then? Can you think of anything you would have done differently? What part of you makes you most angry or hurt about what happened? And what's familiar about this feeling or incident that happened to you? If somebody feels intense panic or intense anger, we can almost be assured, again, like these things don't happen in a vacuum. Like when we talk about microaggressions, people often go like, why, this was just such a small thing, why are we so upset? But if you, again, like take a step back and recognize this isn't just about this moment, but it's always pulled by the feelings and the experiences of the pain throughout our lifetimes, which again, like any other idea in psychology, you can see this, right? If somebody, I don't know, had an alcoholic parent, and that was always very strongly like yelling and berating them growing up, a raised tone from someone else can mean like they just feel that trauma coming back up in their bodies somatically, and they can be taken back to shrinking and to hiding, or not feeling like they could say anything. That is not something that we would blame them for having that response. And it's not something that someone maybe who raised their tone slightly from a different culture where that was normal and like something that was done to have a voice in the family that they were in. We wouldn't expect them to maybe see that right away. So the goal is not to not ever have ruptures, but knowing that ruptures will happen, we will disconnect at times, and how do we like move back towards one another in that. Asking what's been the hardest thing for you in this process, and then what do you want, what do you need to move forward in that. So last thing that I wanted to do, I just wanted to talk about some scenarios and kind of go through this as a way of highlighting how this could look different if we were really trying to embrace the counseling center paradigm through a restorative justice practice lens. So I'll do these kind of quickly, but I hope it gives us some ideas, again, of just, there's so many different aspects of our world where we could like critically think and examine, like, is this helping, or could we do this in a more restorative way, aligned with those values? I do want to say counseling centers don't live in a vacuum. It is one system within a system within a system. And again, like we can't fully replace the current model with all restorative practices. There are legal, ethical, HR, other things that get in the way. I think being transparent about what those are and speaking to those directly is a helpful piece, though, so that we recognize the complexity that people are holding in that. And Dr. Kenneth Hardy really talks about some lovely aspects of that complexity and contextual talk in his book on supervision and family therapy for diversity consciousness, like in supervision, which I just recommend, again, as another helpful way to frame some of these intergroup dialogues. We want to transition and shift the mindset towards the self and others as interdependent with practice and time. So again, set our expectations appropriately, but take meaningful commitments towards interrogating policies and practices with relentless curiosity and a desire to reconnect. So Dr. Hardy talks about context talk, which is, again, positioning yourself in the context of your privileged or subjugated identities. So me as a person, let's say with ADHD, if I'm being told a policy of like punitive measures that will be taken if people's notes are more than 5 days old, then I might say, like, you know, as somebody with ADHD, there's a very hard time doing these things in a vacuum, especially when we're crushed by a lot of pressures and demands from the system. I'm going to need more support or structured or scaffolding or understanding, you know, and ways to approach me rather than just punishing me and taking something away after 5 days of having not written notes. And that's something, again, you'd have to collaborate with, you know, others to help bring awareness to. And I think once you can respect and be open to hearing people's needs, then you can have a lot of creative problem solving, which I've had like at different points in my counseling center career with the people around you to help support and keep that accountable. But really wanting to position those identity factors. My old Trinidadian admin supervisor, clinical director, who I loved very much, she would often talk about putting on her admin cap and like taking it from that perspective, which again, like I think helped split, at least, and helped us understand her from a multitude of perspectives. She's not just a Black woman. She's not just like a staff member who's also like been in the trenches with us, like doing some of this work, but she's also a supervisor, also an admin, and navigating those complexities is really hard. So by being able to see that part of them that struggles with the admin piece, but has to hold it, it helps humanize in my mind and see that. So whether that's you as a trainee, you as a Black man, like owning those contextual identities from where you're speaking in the conversation can be helpful. Practice to train awareness and understanding yourself and increasing mentalization with others, seeing perspective taking from others, and compassion is really meaningful. And then be creative with the methods and format to fit your own social cultural context within the center and iterate. Don't experiment, iterate and experiment. Don't just think of this as like, okay, we did it. We set up the circles. We're perfect. That's great. Never perfect, always progressing in this. So if I'm going through these real quick, staff meetings have no time for emotional focused conversations due to long agendas each week. Again, like I mentioned before, it'd really be helpful to set aside a singular time each week that's blocked off people's schedules from other kinds of appointments so that you can have a consistent way to connect from a human perspective where nothing is meant to be productive or get done. Because again, that is the kind of time that we need to commit to be able to find ourselves within the center as a whole, especially for me, who's worked at larger centers like NC State, Ohio State, University of South Florida. It can be very easy to drift apart the larger the center gets. So having that unified time where it's not just an agenda, here's this, here's this, here's the next speaker, here's this. I remember people hating staff meetings so much at Ohio State for how bland and droll it felt. And so we do need that. We need some space for those agenda items. So you can still have your staff meeting, but we'd need another space as well. You know, we need the yin and the yang in this. The staff member states, I don't want this meeting to turn into group therapy when somebody expresses frustration. Let's think about that deeply. What does it mean when we say, and this is again, group coordinator, a little biased here. What does it mean when we say, I don't want this to turn into group therapy? Because when I think about like what group therapy means to me, group therapy means to me increasing awareness of ourselves and others. And so if we're saying, I don't want people to have emotions or to feel some way towards me, then we're saying like, I don't want you to be human. I want you to stay objective, productive, cognitive, analytical. And again, it enforces this narrative that our adults, our cognitive mind, as opposed to our emotional inner child, the adult mind is the one that's right, and the emotional inner child is the one that needs to be pushed away and like needs to be ignored. Thich Nhat Hanh's book, Reconciliation, Healing the Inner Child, I think really helps elevate that as purposeful. Like we need our emotional side. It is what makes us humane in that way. And so recognizing the difference between safety and comfort, I think is really key in these discussions, right? That we're wanting people to feel safe enough, but the comfort is not a guarantee for anybody. And if you want your comfort as a white, like identified staff member, if I want to feel comfortable, sometimes that means I'm not, like the staff of color are just feeling the discomfort for me. I'm not actually getting rid of the discomfort, it's just being placed in a different area of the group. So rather than thinking like, oh, thank goodness, I'm safe, I want to say like, how can I hold that discomfort with you? Because now I'm connecting with you and we're holding it together. We can both feel the discomfort, but usually it's only maybe you as a subjugated identity that's hold on to this, like this pressure, this hurt, this discomfort. So being mindful of that, like if we're saying we don't want this to be group therapy, are we talking about we don't want emotions to be present in that, and how can we challenge and lean into that? Signing up for walk-in crisis shifts, there's a counseling center that utilized a shared sign-up sheet that went live at 9 a.m. and everybody affectionately, not so affectionately, called it the Hunger Games sign-up. And so that meant that every person would have to jump on at 9 a.m. and sign up for the shifts, first come, first serve. Everybody just like taking slots and taking it from one another. And thinking about, again, like, what does that do to us? Does that bring us to a sense of community? Is this a every person for themselves kind of mentality? That seems to align very much with individualistic and Eurocentric kind of values, right? Ideally, like, and this is something in a previous center that I was more connected to, we would often have some dialogues or conversations. There would be some randomness in signing up, but if there were conflicts or things that people needed, they'd be able to speak to it in an open space to say, hey, I need to pick up my kid at daycare at Friday morning, so I can't have this on-call shift this semester. Can I do it a different day and time? Would somebody be willing to switch with me? Because then again, like when I hear somebody say that, I'm like, oh shit, I have a daughter. I know how hard it is to be a parent. I want to help that person. I want to make things easier for them. And it's a loving act for me to take that, like, and trade with a different day for them. Something that, you know, I may still suffer and be kind of like, like annoyed that I have to do that Friday mornings, but it feels purposeful. It feels meaningful. You know, this isn't about a good or bad feeling. This is about, is this a meaningful feeling? Because if I had to feel slightly annoyed, but I'm doing it through an act of love, then that feels more gratifying than just being missing a sign-up sheet or having my schedule completely scattered with different appointments throughout the semester instead of a consistent day, consistent time, to kind of have that safety, that certainty each week. So a microaggression made over a staff email chain by a member, which offends various staff members. again, I think the idea of having people say, I'd like to call a circle to this like issue, and this is the beauty of having a separate like space, is you can say like, okay, let's take this to the circle this Friday, and then we'll process this and see each other and talk about each of our experiences. The member, again, doesn't have to have done it purposely. It doesn't have to be like something where their person, this is the problem, we need to get rid of them. But by being able to honor and see that, it allows us to increase our mindfulness and our awareness as to what people's needs are and how they get harmed by these different aspects of life, which is a meaningful like pain. And Menachem, from my grandmother's hand, talks about the difference between clean pain and dirty pain, clean pain being purposeful, which again, I think really aligns with Buddhism in that way. We have a lot of garbage moments in life, but if you look deeply at the garbage and you cultivate it correctly, it can turn into fertilizer, which can blossom the rose. So the rose turns into garbage when it wilts and passes. The garbage can turn back into a rose if nourished correctly. So this is about nourishing those garbage ruptures, those moments, to have meaning from them. Male staff member makes objectifying comments towards a female staff member. Again, like I think oftentimes these things can be done where they reconcile, or they somebody talks to an admin, another person talks to another supervisor, and then the supervisors talk to one person, and everything is done behind closed doors and like within like that individual's like own rooms. And there's never really a reconcile. There's just like okay, we told them that they said they won't do it again, right? And there's this tension and dissonance, and we don't see them as caring or meaningful unless we are able to like have them feel like we're seen for our pain and suffering. So being able to use some of that like rupture circle process that we talked about before to meet the woman, the female staff member, where they're at, what they need, if they'd be open to having a like circle process or rupture conference, having supportive people on their side, as well as the other person, the male like staff member, having other people of support, or maybe other people that like have been affected by that incident, their presence, so that we can own accountability and responsibility if they take responsibility and accountability for the impact that they have, and talk about how to make it right, what steps they're taking. Because again, like if I take like a course or I read a book or something about internal misogyny, then that's like a meaningful act. You know, it was labor, it was work, but it was meaningful work, and I did it for me kind of honoring that person and their worth to me, the pain that they had. Triangulation within the counseling center has always been problematic in different ways, right? People talking behind each other's back. So that often leads to people wanting to constrict communication, but sometimes by triangulating and saying like, oh, we don't want to triangulate people, we can sometimes reinforce the triangulation itself. So I'd often have like the time where I would reach out to, in different counseling centers, a supervisor, and then I would have that supervisor talk to my direct supervisor, and then they would talk to me and say, hey, why are you talking to that person? And that kind of caught me back, like, oh, well, I didn't realize that was a problem. I just wanted to connect with them as a human and get to know them. So the fear of their being triangulated before in previous relationships and previous ruptures within the center has now led to them triangulating me. And having a circle process where we can all kind of see and notice those unconscious patterns, because I don't think there was any ill will like when that stuff happened. I think it was just like based in the fear, based in that like, you know, protective, like closing off to community as opposed to opening up to community and understanding and really wanting people to see their humanness and their hurt, and that led them to reenact that behavior. Admin team having private closed meetings, which discuss proposals from staff members as well as new policies and procedures that get announced in staff meetings. So this is like, you know, the admin team being the little cabal at the top of the hierarchy. I think you can do things to open up that process, right? There are things I'm sure that for HR and other reasons you can't share, and you have to like have some communication or space separate from folks. But if a task is going to involve admin discussing a topic that involves like, let's say, the group program or the master's level, like intern training, then we should invite at least the person involved in group programming, maybe the other people affected by that, like an open invitation to a space. Maybe admin meets at the same time and day each week, and then everybody can be cognizant of having that be a desk hour. In case they need to attend the admin meeting, they can use that writing time that they would normally have to attend part of it that involves them, so that they can feel seen, you can feel heard, you can speak and advocate for your needs. And you can also hear from the people themselves instead of telephoning why things didn't work out or what they can do to help make it come to fruition. Many times I felt like things have gotten stuck in limbo where someone communicates on my behalf, it doesn't actually feel like they communicated it well, and then I'm stuck kind of waiting for them to correctly convey it to them, and that takes months. So having that transparency, like an openness, I think can be a meaningful restorative way to feel heard and seen. 3 trainees, new staff are all asked to run the trans support group at the center, which is typically run every year by a senior staff member that's separate from them. In this way, I typically, as a group coordinator, when everybody wants to sign up for the same group and we don't have enough slots, I like to bring people together, ideally, so that we can each hear why it's meaningful and important for them, like why they want to run the trans support group. And then how can we as a group kind of creatively problem solve ways for them to get their needs met in the best way. Maybe after hearing how valuable it is for each person, we will have some people recognize that this is maybe okay for me to take a step back for, because I'm really excited for how meaningful of a part of this person's journey this is going to be to have this training experience. Maybe we have a process observer, maybe we have other aspects that we can work through with that. But it allows us to be creative and curious around those solutions as a circle, not as a person commanding or kind of doing backdoor deals and conversations. And lastly, a staff member shown to have a task list of over 150 unwritten notes, never had that before in my life, leads to us shutting off access to any staff or trainees seeing each other's task lists. This really hurts me and feels really sad, because I think some of the things that were the most meaningful moments in my counseling career were at USF, when people would see my task list being larger than it should be, and saying like, hey buddy, noticed that you were really struggling, wanted to check in and see how I could help. And for me, as somebody neurodivergent with ADHD, it's really meaningful to be given that kind of compassion and support for something that's like shameful and makes me feel a lot of guilt, and being seen again, not as the problem. Because if we start looking at a staff member and we see their notes unwritten and we say, God, what an irresponsible like jerk, he gets on me for writing notes and he doesn't write notes. Like, to me, it's like we're blaming the flower for the drought. Like, if you're not able to complete your notes, there's a reason why you have to sacrifice note writing because of what's happening around you in the system. And if we were all able to bear witness to that and see that and honor that, I think we would all have a lot more compassion and love and care for one another in helping us say, what do we need to do to make this system good enough for each of us to thrive and blossom? So hope that was helpful. That's some vignettes, and thank you all for your time.